Hi, this video is a part of the recordings on your chapter 6, which is titled Government Intervention, and we're covering different kinds of policies where the government tries to correct difficulties or challenges faced by markets in situations where price volatilities could disenfranchise certain segments of a marketplace. In this particular video, we are going to be covering price controls, and the specific price control that we're going to look at is called a price floor, a binding price floor. And in order to motivate this situation, we're going to introduce the subject of a minimum wage. There's a related set of topics called living wages, and living wages are study in labor economics, which are a subspecialty of microeconomics. And what labor economists try to do is to decide what sort of a wage would actually enable people in a particular region to have a living wage, a wage that would be able to provide for quality of life in a particular area that would be considered minimal, if not ideally minimal, where you get all your needs and some of your wants covered by the wages created by the labor of people. So we're going to talk about a labor market in this particular story. This particular labor market, therefore, will have a vertical axis where we are talking about wages as the prices here. The wage is going to be the dollars earned per hour of work. And then we're also going to talk about, on the horizontal axis, the amount of labor provided by people. And so labor is going to be measured in units of hours provided of labor. Okay. And in this case, the supply of labor is going to be illustrated by just for clarity, illustrated by the S for supply, and I'm putting workers in parentheses so that you can see that we're talking about the people who offer hours of work are called workers. And we're going to also generate a demand for labor, and we're going to assume that demand for labor is generated by companies or firms. In some situations, firms don't demand labor. For example, if you have your own house and you hire a landscape artist or a landscape company to come and supply you, you may wish to look at that as the market for landscape services, and the supplier of the landscaping services is in effect the company, the worker, i.e. the worker is the self-employed owner of his or her company, and you are the consumer of these landscape services. Or if somebody comes to your home and fixes something in your home, like plumbing or electrical or structural problems or remodeling issues, design problems with your home, you might look at those situations differently than this one. In this particular case, the consumers are called companies who hire workers, and the supply is called workers. And the little asterisk, the star at the middle, shows us the original equilibrium. In this particular example, I'm not going to start with a shock to the system, but in effect, these price controls are typically driven by something happening prior to the implementation of the price control. In this case, you might have a situation where the original marketplace is generating outcomes that somebody from a normative perspective might not find ideal. So somebody might say that the that the equilibrium wage that this market generates is not enough to earn a decent living for people who work in this region of the world, and that the amount of labor being willing to provide services, the amount of hours of labor will be associated also with this initial value. Okay, so we have an equilibrium wage and an equilibrium amount of labor provided, and a normative assessment that this may be an unreasonable wage. And as a result of that normative assessment, of that normative opinion that might be arrived at by a democratic consensus, an election vote or whatnot, we then are going to look at the imposition of a binding price floor. So we're going to say that this is a level of salaries per hour wage that nobody's allowed to pay less than that. And as a result, the equilibrium market wage becomes illegal or untenable because the binding price floor is above it. So that's one of the characteristics of binding price floors, that the resulting price must be above what the market would find itself in equilibrium. And again, that creates a situation where the quantity demanded for labor becomes a lot less at that point. And so the amount of employment hours resulting from a price floor would decrease from the market being allowed to be in equilibrium. And of course, workers would love to work more hours because the opportunity cost of work has now increased with a higher wage. And as a result, from having this minimum wage, we develop an excess supply of labor. So technically speaking, the level of unemployment has two aspects to it. The people who lost employment in response to the policy, and also the people who are now looking for work, or the hours of labor that were looking for employment that weren't looking at employment at the lower wage, who now also find themselves unemployed. So there's a dual impact on the labor force reduction. In terms of what's occurring to the producer surplus, the old producer surplus was the triangle that I'm drawing in purple right now. And the new producer surplus is now the area that I'm drawing in green. So as you can see, there is a gain in producer surplus here from the redistribution of value added from the market to the hands of the workers. That is, the workers who are working per hour and earning a higher wage rate per hour. But there's also a loss of producer surplus from the hours of employment that are no longer offered by the marketplace. And in effect, there's also a loss consideration from the labor hours that become available as a result of the policy. And whether you count those or not depends on what assumptions you're making about the labor market and the workforce formation in this region. Under ceteris paribus, you would not necessarily count that part as loss of producer surplus. You would count it as part, you wouldn't even count it as part of the deadweight loss. In addition to that, you also have a loss to consumers, i.e. in this case firms, because their surplus also declines. First thing we'll see about consumer surplus, in this case the consumers again are the firms, and the original consumer surplus was below the demand curve for labor and above the equilibrium price. So it's this neat right triangle in green. That's the original consumer surplus. And in response to the minimum wage ordinance, what we see is that we observe a decline in the consumer's surplus due to the higher wage per hour that the firms have to pay workers working. So workers gain and firms lose the area that I am covering in X's. The only area that remains viable for the firms as surplus, consumer surplus for the firms, is an area that I'll highlight in blue. And we have, unfortunately, deadweight loss from units of labor that are no longer hired in this market in response to the higher minimum wage. And so what creates a decision about this policy being socially desirable or socially undesirable is a function of whether the minimum statutory wage above the market equilibrium wage results in gains to workers that more than offset the losses to firms and the losses to those people who buy products from this particular market. Because after all, workers' wages are a cost of supplying something for the firms. So as you create minimum wages, you're elevating the costs and limiting the number of labor hours that a company will use in the production of its goods and services. That will result in perhaps less supply of their own goods, and that'll have spillover effects in other markets that you would want to count in the analysis of costs and benefits. Ceteris paribus, all else being the same, if that's your going assumption, you only compare the losses by the deadweight loss to society, to both workers and firms in just this one market. And you observe if the gain by consumers or the loss by consumers, in this case by firms, is worth that loss to the workers gaining a higher wage, albeit at way lower, and in this particular graphic, at way lower levels of available workforce. So this video has been an example of an illustration of price control, a binding price floor. The reason why government would intervene in a marketplace to create such conditions would be normative usually, and they would involve an assessment that the market produces wages that are not consistent with what should be a living wage in a particular region. And that would be a normative, not a positive consideration from a philosophical point of view. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it was useful. I hope the graph made sense, and there will be more to come.